everyone. My name is Shawn, and welcome to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Hi, everyone. Shawn here with another episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. For my 11th episode, I will continue to discuss some parallels between JRR Tolkien's work and the myths that he took inspiration from, as I have on my two previous episodes. First, we covered the cursed ring Andvaranat, which inspired Sauron's One Ring. Then we moved into the riddle contest of the Norse world and how they influenced the story of Bilbo Baggins' little underground verbal duel with the creature Gollum, as shown in The Hobbit. We also talked about how both Odin and Bilbo managed to win their contests through cleverness and luck rather than raw force, specifically getting out of their situations using wordplay, accidental loopholes, and in Bilbo's case, a mild panic that may have led to an evolutionary but unseen impulse to simply survive. You know, the same skill set most of us use when sending work emails with less than ideal news about a work project that was not done in time, which I heard happens often with unnamed friends of mine. In today's episode, we're continuing that exploration of wordplay, persuasion, and, quote, talking your way out of things, or I guess in two things as well, this time with the wizard Gandalf as one of our stars. We'll look at two moments in The Hobbit where Gandalf uses verbal finesse instead of magic or muscle to steer things in his favor, with one story directly drawing from a poem found in the Poetic Edda, specifically the poem Alvismal. In that myth, the Norse god Thor uncharacteristically defeats an opponent using words and not bashing their head in with his hammer Mjolnir, a skill set he may have learned from the Allfather and his actual father, Odin. Which brings me to a quick note before we jump in. I've mentioned this before, but I've got a daughter on the way, and I wanted to milk that fact by having an episode called Mythic Parenting 101, where I would dive into Odin and Thor's father-son dynamic, looking at how their relationship shows up directly in the poem Harbardslaud and less directly elsewhere in the Eddas. But for the sake of time and preparation, today I'm going to focus on the three stories I just mentioned, and we'll focus on Odin and Thor's relationship in the next episode. There are many stories to cover that give us some insight into Odin's approach as a parent, and covering 5 or 6 stories in one episode would be a bit too much. So to sum it up, this episode serves as a bridge from my last episode where I discussed the wordplay parallels in the Norse myths and The Hobbit, and will then serve as a bridge to the next episode when we close with Alvismal, where Alvismal may highlight Thor's own growth, as mentioned, maybe inspired by Odin's parenting. So to get started, picking up from last week's discussion of Bilbo and Odin's riddle contest, and my discussion on how both real and fictional characters can use the power of words, clever sentence structure, and the strategic withholding of information, I'm going to turn to Gandalf, Bilbo, and the 13 dwarves as they simply try to find a place to stay during their journey, and their fascinating interaction with the skin changer, Beorn. This interaction took place in the 7th chapter of The Hobbit called Queer Lodgings. This is 2 chapters after the chapter Riddles in the Dark we discussed last week, with Bilbo becoming the new bearer of the One Ring of Sauron and having that tense meeting with Gollum. That chapter ended with Bilbo escaping the caves of the Misty Mountains by bypassing Gollum and a group of goblins. In chapter 6, he then reunites with his crew of Gandalf and the 13 dwarves, not telling them about the ring. However, the group is still under threat of goblins and their wolves, to the point where a group of eagles needed to come in and pick them up to carry them to safety. The head eagle did this because Gandalf had saved his life previously. The eagles dropped them off to safety and then part ways, ending the chapter. Then, with chapter 7, the group, still somewhat off course, at Gandalf's instructions, makes their way to the hall of a being known as Beorn, who is an old and powerful skin changer, an already large man who sometimes takes the form of a bear. Gandalf gives us a description of Beorn, and per Gandalf, he changes his skin. Sometimes he is a huge black bear. Sometimes he is a strong black-haired man with huge arms and a great beard, completely unlike Shawn from Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Some say he is a bear descended from the great and ancient bears of the mountain and lived there before the giants came. Others say he is a man descended from the first men who lived long before Smaug or any other dragons came into this part of the world. Gandalf closes with, he is not the sort of person to ask questions of. Beorn also likes his privacy, and does not often allow visitors, though he does live with farm animals who he speaks to. He only eats honey, which could indicate maybe he is actually a bear in man form and not the other way around. He has a hall with a nice fire pit in the middle that luckily the book gives us a lovely picture of. If Beorn was away and wanted to rent out this property as a bed and breakfast and added some Irish whiskey, some steaks, and 3 to 4 video games of my choice, I would call that a pretty damn good weekend. Missed opportunity on Beorn's part for some additional income. Then again, I grew up in a capitalistic society that values dollar signs and forever wanting more, as opposed to finding internal peace that I'm sure Beorn has. So anyway, Gandalf, with his crew out of supplies and needing a place to stay, wants to navigate this interaction with the powerful Beorn delicately. He has Bilbo go with him to Beorn's. His plan is to have the dwarfs go to the hall, 2 and in one case 3 at a time, but only every 5 minutes or so after Gandalf and Bilbo initially went. His plan was to ease Beorn into initially being okay with just 2 strangers at his hall, but slowly build up more and more until they got to the 15 that made up the group. If they showed up as a group of 15 initially, Beorn's quote welcome may have not been as pleasant and potentially acted in a manner more defensively and aimed at protecting his home. And that is where Gandalf's power with words comes in. Gandalf and Bilbo enter the gate to Beorn's land, and the horses there immediately go to Beorn and tell him about the strangers. The pair then approach Beorn, who asks them what the hell they want. Gandalf introduces himself as a wizard and Bilbo as a hobbit. Beorn doesn't seem to know of Gandalf, but he does know about the wizard Radagast, who Gandalf is also an acquaintance of for obvious reasons, and the text even states that they are cousins. Gandalf mentions that, quote, we, which could mean any number more than one, had a wrench thrown into their journey due to the goblins. Beorn does not like goblins either, and upon hearing this, invites Bilbo and Gandalf into his aspiring Airbnb of a hall to hear their story. Gandalf starts by saying he was coming over the mountains with a friend or 2, meaning more than just his one friend, Bilbo, implying that there are at least 3 individuals. Beorn immediately calls out Gandalf's dishonesty. Gandalf apologizes and states that he did not want to bother Beorn with more than 2 people, and state that he could call, quote, the others into the hall. Beorn allows this. Gandalf calls in 2 dwarves, making their party 4 now. Beorn once again calls out Gandalf's dishonesty. However, at this point, Beorn is intrigued enough to want to hear their tale, and he lets them in. So this subtle wordplay by Gandalf, he plants the seeds after getting invited into Beorn's hearth by telling a story about their adventure, putting Beorn into a situation where he says, well, I invited 2, what's 2 more? Also worthy to note that of the 2 dwarves, one of them was Thorn Oakenshield, who is actually the dwarf's leader and currently an unlanded king. Beorn recognized Thorin as the son of Thrain, son of Thror. So just funny that Beorn knows of Thorin, but not Gandalf and Bilbo. As I mentioned earlier, Gandalf already drew attention to Beorn's old age, and that shows why he would know of Thorin's grandfather. So not only was Gandalf planting the seeds of a good story, but also was strategic in allowing Thorin to be among the first dwarves to enter the hall. Beorn knew of the wizard Radagast, and thus may have let his defenses down with Gandalf. Bilbo was a small hobbit who probably would not be considered dangerous, and now there is a well-renowned dwarf from a noble family. Gandalf also probably knew Beorn had no love for goblins, and as Beorn kept to himself, he probably enjoys hearing stories every now and then on the few scenarios where he serves as a host. So far a good plan by Gandalf. Beorn completely sees through Gandalf's dishonesty, but lets him keep going. Gandalf continues, sprinkling more hints throughout his story in well-placed words that would logically require an expanded number of individuals in their party. Each time, Beorn calls out Gandalf for his dishonesty, but allows Gandalf to call more members of the party into his hall. And as I mentioned earlier, those individuals are ready to come in every 5 or so minutes, as I mentioned. Also, something funny is that each time the additional dwarves enter, they state that they are at Beorn's service. And each time, Beorn makes it very clear he does not need their service. But again, he wants Gandalf to continue their tale, so he is fine with it. The interaction ends with the party of 15, Gandalf, Bilbo, and the 13 dwarves having lodging for the night. Beorn actually acknowledges that Gandalf may have made the whole thing up, as far as their story with the goblins, but in either case, he was entertained enough to allow it to continue. And he also called out this story of their adventure as an intangible gift that compelled him to give something back, in this case, a place to stay for the night. So no real magic was involved, but Gandalf's storytelling and his careful drip feeding of information shows how words themselves can function like a kind of spell. He guides Beorn's attention, manages his expectations, and lets curiosity do the heavy lifting. Each reveal feels like the natural next step in the journey, not a blunt request to continue allowing two more mouths to feed through the door. And that is the art in it. We see the same craft in music, poems, speeches, anything where the pacing and structure pull the listener forward and make them want to hear the next piece. And honestly, Tolkien pulling this from the Norse tradition makes perfect sense. Those myths constantly highlight the power of words. And imagine you are a kid in 9th century Denmark, no TV, no phones, no doom scrolling on social media, just you sitting by the fire with friends and family while a wandering storyteller comes through the village. If the storyteller, while telling a story, just says, Sigurd killed the dragon, the end, that is really not a good story. But if he uses rhythm, suspense, little seeds of detail that make you lean in, suddenly the whole hall is listening. Imagine if the storyteller instead says, and the furious dragon Fafnir, with his flaming wings and breath of fire, was slain by the son of Sigmund. Makes for a better story. And in that case, the son of Sigmund is a kenning for Sigurd. The listener may then literally ask for more. Oh, can you now tell us about this Sigmund? I want to hear about him. Then the storyteller could go into Sigurd's father, Sigmund. In this example, both Sigmund and Sigurd, characters from the House of Volsung, have great stories to tell. In the former example of just saying what happened may have not gotten the desired result of the storyteller. Just like if Gandalf came in and simply said, there are 15 of us and we would like a place to stay. That may not have worked. Instead of overwhelming Beorn with 15 uninvited guests, he gives him a story built step by step, each part making the next part feel natural. And sure enough, by the end, Beorn is not annoyed, he is entertained, and hospitality feels like the obvious conclusion. We see how carefully chosen words and timing can secure agreement and cooperation. Next, we will see a slightly different scenario, and this takes place earlier in The Hobbit, before Beorn and before the Riddles in the Dark chapter, a situation that involves trolls, not goblins, and our heroes. Here, it's not clever persuasion, but quick thinking and situational awareness to navigate their way out of another pickle, where once again, members of our party are at threat to be eaten. In chapter 2 of The Hobbit, called Roast Mutton, when this chapter begins, Bilbo, after being nudged out of the door of Bag End by Gandalf, is continuously wondering why he joins the company on this adventure. And the text says, to the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside, without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished. One just wanted to throw that in as a tiny hat tip to the Lord of the Rings scene, where Pippin mourns the lack of a second breakfast while Aragorn stares at him like he's malfunctioning. Anyway, off goes Bilbo on this adventure, whose belly is only filled with 1.5 breakfasts, which is probably little enough for a hobbit to be hangry, and he's going on this ridiculous quest. Now, from the beginning, the dwarves are suspicious about Gandalf's decision to bring Bilbo. Do they really need a, quote, burglar? Is Bilbo's small stature supposed to qualify him for the job? And should they really pin the success of this entire mission on a hobbit who's never burgled anything in his entire life? And to be honest, you have to sort of agree with the dwarves here. They are trying to reclaim their kingdom, as we discussed in our last episode. And this hobbit just wanted to tag along for the adventure. The motivations here are considerably unbalanced. And for the record, I personally stole 7 packs of 1997 Fleer Ultra baseball cards from a CVS when I was 10. So I feel I technically have more claim to the title of burglar than Bilbo. Note that I was raised in a guilt-heavy branch of Christianity, so yes, I still think about this and still feel bad about it. Also, I intermittently fast, so I don't even need 1 breakfast, let alone 2. I'm just saying that clearly the dwarves and Gandalf picked the wrong guy. Anyway, the dwarves' doubts are not subtle. And Bilbo absolutely feels their skepticism creeping under his skin. And this becomes this quiet pressure to prove himself or to go home a failure. Then, very early on this journey, the company has a setback. The weather takes a nasty turn, and they had to navigate rain and mud. They tried to find a dry place to have supper for the night. However, one of their ponies then got spooked and fled. This pony happened to be carrying their food and equipment, and as it crossed over a river, the contents of that equipment all washed away. And to top it off, they also realized that Gandalf was missing as well. And in The Hobbit, you see this more than once, where Gandalf unexpectedly leaves company to everyone's dread, as him being a wizard surely would benefit the group, especially in times like this, only for him to come back exactly when he's needed, to the point where the group didn't always get what they wanted, but got what they needed, just like Mick Jagger said. Also, this happens in Lord of the Rings, the book The Two Towers, where as we approach the Battle of Helm's Deep, Gandalf leaves. Everybody is wondering where the hell he went, only for Gandalf to show up just in time to save the day. And unlike the film where Gandalf says that he's going to be arriving at the dawn of light on the third day, he makes no indication in the books when he's going to be coming back. So this Irish goodbye slash return seems pretty consistent on Gandalf's part. Anyway, the now group of 14, being 13 dwarves and an unwanted hobbit, needed to find food and come up with a plan. And in the meantime, unable to start a fire. The dwarves grew restless and began arguing with one another on what to do. They noticed a light in the distance and correctly assumed that it was a fire that was successfully started. They made their way to the light and decided it was Bilbo's turn to prove himself and to go investigate the light. Bilbo, obviously afraid, still wanted to earn his companion's respect and trust, so he went. He creeps up to the fire and finds not travelers, but three trolls, enormous, drunk, and complaining about how they're sick of only eating mutton. Compared to Bilbo especially, they are quite large. Bilbo considers going back to warn the dwarves, especially since Tolkien makes it very clear that trolls love eating dwarves, and these three in particular are extremely bored with their current diet. However, Bilbo, again wanting to impress his companions, decides to pick one of the trolls' pockets for supplies and/or food. This troll was named William, and the other two were Bert and Tom, which are fantastic names for trolls. Notes that Bilbo also considered the benefit of simply sneaking in and stabbing them to death. If you remember in our last episode, Bilbo also had this thought briefly on potentially killing Gollum while invisible. Not necessarily relevant right now, but I think it's cool how Tolkien sort of plants the seeds of these dark, intrusive thoughts in Bilbo, the hero of the story. Anyway, while Tom and Bert went to the keg and probably piss out some of their consumed contents, Bilbo approaches William, puts his hand in his pocket, and unlike 10-year-old me, who is obsessed with a certain brand of baseball cards, was not up for the task. Bilbo was noticed and taken. The other two trolls return and ask Bilbo who he was. Bilbo accidentally gives the trolls a hint that there are more to his party, but offers to cook something for the trolls to try to not be eaten himself. However, the dwarves, one by one, also come to investigate, and are all eventually taken as well, with King Thorin being the last. During the commotion, however, of the dwarves being taken, Bilbo does sort of escape unnoticed and watches the events unfold. His legs were injured due to the commotion, so he sat a bit outside of the firelight. The trolls began to argue over what to do with their newly captured group. At this point, again, just like the Rolling Stones prophesied, the company got what they needed and Gandalf returned. He does not kill the dwarves with thunderbolts and sword in hand, but again uses the power of words to win in this situation. When the trolls are finally settled on the idea and ready to cook the dwarves, Gandalf throws his voice into the ring, pretending to be one of the trolls. And each time, one of the trolls assumes one of his companions is the one talking. Gandalf starts, again, with the trolls not knowing that he's there, by saying, "Well, no use roasting them now. It'll take all night." Bert thought that it was William. Gandalf then seems to respond to his own interjection and says, "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill, or it will take all night." William, then thinking the response was Bert, now says, "Who's arguing?" This, along with more interjections by Gandalf, starts the argument all over again. The trolls, cranky and drunk, resort to insults, with at one point William, I think in this case actually William and not Gandalf, calls Tom a booby. The trolls eventually get over their argument and decide to sit on the sacks that the dwarves were captured in, killing them so that they can be boiled later. However, at this point, Gandalf continues to talk as if he was one of the dwarves and begins arguing over which dwarf they will sit on first. Bert wants to sit on the dwarf with the yellow stockings, but Gandalf says, "Nonsense! The one with the gray stockings." The trolls then begin arguing over who said what and rightfully denying words that were attributed to them. Eventually, Gandalf says something that does seem to be an actual spell, saying, "Dawn take you all, and be stoned to you." At this point, the trolls, with Gandalf's nudging, argued until dawn. The issue is that the trolls cannot be in the sunlight, else they be turned to stone, and they were. So the party, thanks to Gandalf's words, won this situation again. And the rescue hinged on another tactic we often use in this world, stalling for time. Gandalf's strategy may feel magical, however, there was really no magic required in this situation, just the ability to assess the situation and having skill with the tongue. Gandalf bought time during a high-pressure situation, and due to the biology of the trolls, time was his best asset, as it often is. Often in this world, we see people using words to de-escalate situations to slow the moment down. Think of times at work where you repeat the question back to somebody, ask for clarification, or use a non sequitur to provide a non-answer to a question. That deflects the conversation in a whole nother direction. In this case, Gandalf sort of uses well-timed words/questions to drive the conversation further to prevent action, which would have resulted in the deaths of his companions. Anyway, Gandalf and the dwarves at this point were saved. Thorin echoes his inner Elaine Bennis from Seinfeld and tells the dead trolls, "Thanks for muddin'." And Gandalf puts his glasses on and walks in slow motion away from the stone trolls, and they explode without Gandalf turning back. Obviously, I'm kidding because the stone trolls are still there in the events of The Lord of the Rings, as they are noticed by the four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, who have heard the tale told by Bilbo at that point. So that's proof that the stone trolls did not blow up. But Gandalf putting his sunglasses on was definitely in the text. Anyway, I know I've been focusing on Tolkien a bit the last 3 episodes. I'm sure I will many more times when discussing the history/lore of the Tolkien universe. However, for now, that last story with Gandalf and the trolls will wrap up the Tolkien talk for now. But I did want to now discuss the Norse myth that the man drew inspiration from when he wrote Roast Mutton. That being the story found in the Poetic Edda poem Alvasmal, where the Norse god Thor uses a similar but different tactic, harnessing the power of time and words to win a situation with another being, resulting in them being turned to stone. To make things confusing here for the sake of this, the being that Thor, quote, wins against is not a troll, but a dwarf. And the dwarfs in the Norse world are not unlike the dwarves in Tolkien's world, at least as far as their abilities to craft powerful and magical artifacts, as we have discussed with all of the magical items and weapons owned by the gods and heroes in the Norse world. And then you can look at their creation of the armor Mithril in Tolkien's world. The dwarves literally created Thor's hammer Mjolnir and his magical belt. However, Thor, he is a mighty and powerful god, still seems to look at dwarves as less than. During his brother Baldur's funeral, Thor, in his anger and grief, kicks a nearby dwarf into the funeral pyre, killing him. And in this story, he seems not too keen to accept another dwarf's proposal, this dwarf being named Alvis, which Crawford says means all wise, a proposal to marry Thor's daughter, Thrud, a fantastic name for a daughter that actually placed a close second on my wife and I's list of names for our daughter who's coming early next year. Notes that in the poem itself, it does not specifically name Thor's daughter. However, Thor's daughter is named in Skadskaparmal, found in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, when discussing kennings for Thor. Per Skadskaparmal, it says, "How should Thor be referred to? Oh, by calling him the son of Odin and the earth, the father of Magni, Modi, and Thrud, the husband of Sif, the stepfather of Ol, the wielder or possessor of the hammer Mjolnir." So we can make a pretty good claim that Thrud would be Thor's daughter in the poem Alvasmal, though it is entirely possible that the daughter here is just an unnamed daughter as well. So right now, if you want to look at Thrud's ancestry, her father would be Thor, who is the son of Odin, who is the son of Bor, who is the son of Buri. She is also the daughter of Thor, whose mother is Earth, whose father is Delin, whose father is the goddess personification of night, who is the daughter of the bean Narfi. So everybody can expect another family tree that nobody asked for on Instagram. Also, in stanza 36 of the Poetic Edda poem Grimnismal, Odin lists a, quote, thrud as one of his Valkyries. The text says, and this again is Jackson Crawford's translation, and this is Odin speaking, "They bring my horn, my Valkyries, Hrist and Mist, Skageld and Skogul, Hild and Thrud, Clock and Hjörfjot, Gol and Gerulal, Randrith, and Regendief. They bring the Einaha bear." So the Valkyries both pick up the dead bodies from battlefields and serve as Odin's arm, tipping the scale on battles between mortals, and they serve beer. Nice. Anyway, onto the story. Alvis the dwarf comes to Thor's hall asking to marry his daughter. The dwarf is sort of pompous and arrogant in his approach, so maybe Thor's refusal is more based on the character of this dwarf instead of him having a disdain for them as a group of people. Now, the dwarf is persistent to the annoyance of Thor. And at this point, Thor, typically with what we see in the myths, often with the giants, would normally just impulsively kill them. In the case of this dwarf Alvis, however, for some reason, Thor seems content to not lift up his hammer and entertain the dwarf for a bit. And once again, this is where wordplay comes in, which Thor seems to show in channeling his inner Gandalf. And the result is another conversation, this time between Thor and Alvis, that serves as world building for the reader, allowing them to better understand the universe in which these gods live in. Not unlike Vathruthnismal we discussed in our last episode, and Voluspa, which I have probably brought up in every episode just to name a couple. Thor tells Alvis, after some passive-aggressive comments by the dwarf, that the only way he would consider this marriage is if the dwarf tells Thor everything he wants to know about all of the realms. And this starts the chain of Thor asking Alvis questions, and Alvis successfully answering questions about them. Also note that prior to this stanza, in stanza 5, Alvis asks Thor who gave him the rings that he wore, implying that the dwarves also made Thor's own rings, just like they did on Varanat, Anvari's cursed ring, and Draupnir, which is Odin's ring, we have discussed in the recent episodes. Anyway, Thor asks Alvis many questions. The first is him asking the dwarf what the, quote, earth is. Funny, because the earth is actually Thor's mother. Alvis states that men call it earth, the Aesir call it soil, the Vanir call it road, giants call it green, elves call it growiver, high gods call it clay. With every question, Alvis states what each tribe or being calls something, eventually looping in his own race of dwarves as well. Thor asks Alvis about the sky, the moon, the sun, the clouds, the wind, the lack of wind, the sea, the fire, woods, the night, seed, and ale. Then, after asking Alvis about ale, which Alvis also answers correctly, Thor in stanza 35 then says, "I have never seen a creature who knew so much old lore. But I have deceived you, Alvis, with a terrible lie. You're still up, and it's dawn, dwarf. The sun shines in the hall." So dwarfs in this universe, just like the trolls in Tolkien's, cannot be exposed to sunlight. So Alvis, the quote wise dwarf, really had issues keeping track of time. Despite all of his knowledge, his lust for Thor's daughter seems to have clouded his judgment. So again, Thor, albeit a bit differently than Gandalf, uses a delay tactic in his wordplay and kills his opponent without even feeling the need to lift up his hammer. As mentioned, this is very uncharacteristic of Thor. As mentioned, he often impulsively attacks and kills his opponents when he feels challenged or slighted, sometimes failing, which pisses him off even more. Though here, he seems to take a measured, patient step to get what he wanted in that situation. And like his father Odin, uses wordplay and a reflection of the situation in front of him to win. So before I close things out today, I wanted to zoom back and look at the 3 different strategies we have now seen in this episode. Gandalf with Beorn, Gandalf with the trolls, and now Thor with Alvis the dwarf. Because all 3 of these scenes are basically case studies in how mythic characters handle high-pressure situations with nothing but their words, which again parallels how we navigate most of our lives as well. Since most of us do not have impulses to kill someone else when backed into a corner, well, I guess we probably would if we were a threat to be eaten, as I mentioned with Bilbo, but still. So first you got Gandalf at Beorn's house, this masterclass in quote presentation. Gandalf doesn't barge in with 13 dwarves and a hobbit and say, hey man, can we crash here? He paces the reveal. He builds a story. He uses structure, timing, and tone. He's essentially doing salesmanship, easing Beorn into something he would have rejected outright if it were dumped on him all at once. Second, you've got the troll scene. Gandalf using delay as a weapon. No sword, no fireworks, just well-timed interjections, a little ventriloquism, and the understanding that if he keeps the trolls arguing long enough, the sun will do the rest. He bought time until the conditions changed. It's like the mythic version of stalling in a meeting while you scramble internally for a solution, or redirecting a conversation long enough to cool tempers, or asking a pointed question that makes someone pause before making a bad decision. And third, there's Thor and Alvis. Thor is not trying to charm Alvis the way Gandalf charms Beorn, or pretending to be somebody else to confuse the dwarf. Thor's basically saying, okay, buddy, you claim you're wiser, prove it. Answer every metaphysical question in the cosmos, and he just keeps going and going until dawn. It's sort of a strategic patience in really just assessing the situation stoically to temper the emotions of this hot-headed dwarf, to the point where the dwarf thinks he would get what he wanted, only for Thor to pull the bait and switch, only to find out that Thor was arranging his death. And again, these myths are basically mirrors for how we operate in the real world. With us humans, we soften hard conversations with careful phrasing. We de-escalate tense moments with humor or clarifying questions. We stall when we need time. We adjust what we reveal based on who's listening. The word wordcraft sounds fancy, but it's really just the human instinct to move through the world with a little strategy, communicating with others the best way we know how, through our words. Now, this Thor/Alvis moment is important for what comes next, because Thor's strategy here is weirdly, as I mentioned, un-Thor. He's patient and he's calculated, and in our next episode, I'm going to dive into Thor's growth across the myths, or at least my interpretation of them, since the character development of the gods isn't really stated outright, but it's my subjective interpretation of the myths, and I do like to look at the growth of a lot of these characters like Loki, Odin, and Thor. And with Thor, how much of his actions is shaped by his father Odin, who definitely uses, let's say, quote, creative and manipulative/psychotic methods to influence his son's development. I think this matters because in our short time on the planet, whether we see it as one finite life or part of something bigger after we die, most of us want to grow and to get better. And so much of who we become is shaped, for better or for worse, by our parents, or the people we were raised by in our childhood years and beyond. Their strengths, their flaws, their choices, and their mistakes all ripple through us in ways that we don't always notice until we're adults, interacting with the world ourselves. So I'm going to leave things there for today. Next time, we're going to dive into Odin's parenting style, how it may have shaped Thor, and what the poems Harbard's Laud, Lokasenna, Alvismal, and a few of Thor's more impulsive moments have to say about this dynamic. We are going to wrap up with Thor's last stand at Ragnarok and talk a bit about the legacy that he leaves behind, just as we have done often with Odin in this podcast. Anyway, that's all I had. Thank you again, everybody. Have an amazing day. Thank you for listening to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. If you enjoyed the show, please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, and have a great day.